The arrest of Nick Reiner for the brutal murder of his parents sent shockwaves through both the entertainment world and the wider online community. Almost immediately, fragments of his past resurfaced, with viewers revisiting old videos that once seemed innocuous but now carried an unmistakable sense of foreboding. A clip from 2016, for instance, revealed a chilling statement in which Nick threatened to kill a dog simply because it barked. At the time, the remark was dismissed as a dark joke, but in hindsight, it became a haunting glimpse into a deeply disturbed mind. Alongside this, Nick admitted in the same video to having sick thoughts that required attention, a candid declaration overlooked at the moment, but now interpreted as an unheeded warning. Further unease emerged from the promotional materials for Being Charlie, a film chronicling Nick's struggles with addiction. Rob Reiner, his father, appeared warm, attentive, and eager to connect, yet Nick responded with terse, distant answers, stating plainly, "I was never close to my dad." The coldness extended beyond words. Every glance, gesture, or moment of disengagement radiated discomfort and detachment, suggesting a growing emotional chasm. Observers noted how a young man, familiar with violent talk and indifferent discussions about family, seemed poised on a knife's edge, a single spark away from tragedy. In a particularly haunting video, Nick spoke calmly, almost methodically, about gathering sick thoughts, wandering through the affluent Brentwood neighborhood as the camera followed. The serene setting, with manicured trees and quiet streets, starkly contrasted the disturbing words he uttered. His demeanor was unnerving, an eerie blend of lucidity and instability. At moments, he refused to acknowledge his own identity, his voice carrying arrogance, paranoia, and hints of a swelling ego. One line, later understood as a distorted premonition, captured his chilling detachment. "I am a snail, and I will never fail. And you know what? You'll have to bail me out of jail." What once seemed like a joke now read as a cryptic warning. Subsequent footage compounded the sense of dread. Nick appeared alongside his sister Romy, smoking cannabis, laughing hollowly, and displaying signs of severe psychological strain. In these clips, he openly admitted to having a severe personality disorder, his words delivered bluntly, as if challenging anyone to respond. When a dog interrupted filming unexpectedly, Nick's calm declaration, "I will go kill that dog," highlighted the erosion of moral boundaries and the early signs of a mind teetering toward violence. The combination of wealth, access to treatment programs, and public attention created a strange juxtaposition. The surface of redemption and glamour masked the widening cracks in Nick's mental state. The 2016 promotional interviews painted a stark portrait of a young man trapped between addiction, untreated psychological disorders, and the pressures of family legacy. From the outside, the life of Nick Reiner appeared privileged, orderly, and bright, yet these videos revealed the hidden fractures that would ultimately culminate in unspeakable tragedy. The case of Nick Reiner demonstrates the subtle, yet devastating, warning signs that often go unnoticed. Words, gestures, silences, and expressions may seem inconsequential in isolation, but together they form a pattern, a silent alarm that, if ignored, can lead to catastrophic consequences. In examining these early videos, one cannot help but wonder how much might have been prevented and how early interventions might have changed the course of a life already spiraling toward darkness. The early signs of Nick Reiner's troubled psyche were visible long before the tragic events unfolded, yet they often went unnoticed or misunderstood by those around him. In the 2016 videos, Nick displayed a chilling combination of detachment, arrogance, and an unsettling calm when discussing violent thoughts. One particularly disturbing clip showed him threatening to kill a dog that barked, his tone flat, measured, and devoid of agitation. At the time, viewers might have dismissed it as dark humor, but retrospectively, it was a clear indication of a young man grappling with impulses and emotions he could not process. The acknowledgement of sick thoughts during the same recording was an admission that he was aware of his inner darkness, yet there was no intervention, no one recognizing the urgency of his mental state. This early period coincided with the promotion of Being Charlie, a film inspired by Nick's struggles with addiction. The contrast between him and his father, Rob Reiner, was stark. Rob projected warmth, empathy, and a desire to connect, attempting to bridge the emotional gap that had long existed between them. He spoke at length, sharing stories and expressing concern for Nick's well-being, his voice softening when discussing his son. Nick, in turn, responded with clipped, cold remarks, avoiding eye contact and displaying a rigidity in posture and expression that communicated disengagement. He admitted plainly, "We didn't connect much when I was young," offering no elaboration, no emotional insight, leaving an almost palpable void. This was not mere teenage rebellion. It was a manifestation of profound emotional withdrawal, a barrier that obscured any genuine interaction. The videos and interviews highlighted patterns that were deeply concerning. Nick spoke openly about his addiction and multiple rehab attempts, 18 times to be precise. Yet he framed these experiences not as steps toward recovery, but as mechanisms to escape the noise and pressure of life. Drugs were described not as pleasure, but as tools to deaden sensation, a way to cope with an overwhelming reality imposed by external expectations and internal chaos. This coping strategy, however, did not address the root causes of his instability. His detachment in interviews, his monotone delivery, and his lack of visible emotion suggested a person increasingly alienated from his own feelings and the world around him. One striking feature of Nick's behavior was the apparent inability to form genuine emotional connections, even with his parents who had tried relentlessly to provide love and stability. Rob and Michelle Reiner's interventions, while well-intentioned, sometimes carried the unintended effect of enforcing control rather than fostering autonomy. Nick's perception of care as constraint created internal tension, and he admitted to feeling trapped by his parents' concern. Music, once a survival instinct and a source of creative liberation, became another domain where he felt restricted. He explained that being excessively monitored and guided stifled the very outlet that had once allowed him to process emotion and existence. His statements conveyed a paradox, aware of the love surrounding him, yet feeling suffocated and incapable of genuine expression within it. The promotional interviews often juxtaposed Rob's earnestness against Nick's cold indifference, creating an atmosphere where tension was visible but largely unaddressed. Rob sought to humanize his son's struggles, attempting to show the world that Nick's life could be understood and redeemed through connection and empathy. Nick, however, remained guarded. He employed humor and detachment as defenses, turning interactions into performances that masked underlying turmoil. Even when discussing rehab, homelessness, or addiction, his demeanor remained calm, almost clinical, yet it carried subtle signs of instability, restless hands, avoidance of eye contact, and forced smiles that never reach his eyes. Nick's self-reported detachment extended beyond his parents. He frequently presented his life and experiences as if recounting a narrative about someone else. The casual descriptions of homelessness across multiple states, Maine, New Jersey, Texas, were delivered without emotion, reducing significant suffering to mere statements of fact. These dry reports painted a picture of a person who had become increasingly disconnected from his own experience, unable or unwilling to integrate the emotional consequences of his actions and choices. His candidness, though striking, revealed a mind oscillating between lucidity and deep psychological instability. In these early glimpses, there was a recurring theme. Nick's personality appeared to be shaped by an internalized cycle of resentment, isolation, and control. He described moments of feeling compelled to use substances as a response to imposed restrictions rather than personal desire. He acknowledged the paradox of appreciating his parents' care while simultaneously resenting it. This tension, unresolved and chronic, created a fertile ground for explosive behavior when combined with his diagnosed schizophrenia and the intermittent effects of psychiatric medication adjustments in the months preceding the tragedy. Ultimately, Part 2 paints a portrait of a young man who exhibited multiple red flags: violent ideation, emotional withdrawal, repeated rehab admissions, detachment from family and self, and a growing reliance on substances to cope. Each video, each statement, each gesture was a small piece of a larger puzzle, one that, if properly interpreted, might have served as a warning. In hindsight, the signs were unmistakable, yet they remained largely unheeded, contributing to a slow, silent escalation toward the horrific events that would follow. In the hours following the murder of his parents, Nick Reiner displayed a level of composure and normalcy that was profoundly unsettling. Surveillance footage from a convenience store and gas station, captured shortly after the tragic events, revealed a man who moved among ordinary customers with a calm, almost mundane demeanor. Nick was dressed in a black and green jacket with white stripes, jeans, black shoes, a baseball cap, and carried a bright red backpack slung over one shoulder. There was no hint of panic, no hurried steps, no trembling or agitation. He stopped at the beverage counter, selected a sports drink, and queued patiently to pay with a credit card. His interaction with the cashier was brief, polite, and entirely unremarkable, leaving observers in disbelief once they realized the context of his actions. The contrast between the horror of the crime and Nick's outward behavior was chilling. Every movement he made seemed deliberately ordinary, as if he were consciously attempting to blend into the fabric of the world he had just shattered. An hour after leaving the store, he was observed standing on the street corner, his posture relaxed yet alert. Then, at 9:15 p.m., 4 LAPD patrol cars, including unmarked units, arrived with flashing red and blue lights. The sudden intrusion transformed the ordinary urban landscape into a site of arrest. The flashing lights cut through the quiet night, interrupting the fragile normalcy of Nick's demeanor. Nick did not flee. He did not resist. As police approached, he raised his hands in compliance, eyes vacant, seemingly resigned to the moment he had long anticipated. The precision and calmness with which he responded to the authorities reinforced the terrifying impression of a person who had detached entirely from the emotional weight of his actions. There was no panic, no pleading, no visible guilt. His composure during the arrest marked a continuation of a pattern that had been evident in earlier videos, a chilling balance between outward control and inner turbulence. To understand the depth of Nick's detachment, it is necessary to examine the context of his upbringing and previous public appearances. The promotional interviews for Being Charlie, the film based on his struggles with addiction, had already displayed his cold, distant persona. In those recordings, Nick rarely made eye contact with his father, Rob Reiner, or the interviewer, speaking in monotone responses that conveyed minimal engagement. Every gesture, every pause, seemed calculated to maintain a barrier between himself and the external world. In hindsight, these behaviors now read as precursors to his ability to navigate the post-crime public space without emotion. Surveillance footage also highlighted the paradox of Nick's external presentation. While he moved through the store and gas station with apparent normalcy, there were subtle indicators of underlying tension. His eyes scanned his surroundings with a measured awareness, his posture rigid yet composed. This duality, the appearance of ordinary behavior masking the inner collapse, produced a deeply unsettling effect. Observers later described a sense of cognitive dissonance, witnessing a person who had committed unspeakable acts yet conducted himself as though nothing had changed. The calmness Nick exhibited was not limited to his physical actions. His mental state, as inferred from previous interviews and statements, suggested a detachment from reality itself. He often spoke about his life experiences, addiction, and familial tensions in a tone devoid of conventional emotional response. Repeated references to substance abuse and rehab indicated a history of coping through dissociation, further suggesting that the post-murder composure was part of an established pattern of emotional regulation, however pathological. This methodical detachment, enabled him to navigate potentially chaotic situations with minimal outward disruption, a trait that is both frightening and rare among individuals committing violent acts. What made the hours following the murders particularly haunting was the stark contrast between Nick and the environment around him. The Brentwood neighborhood, with its manicured lawns, silent streets, and orderly commercial spaces, stood in sharp contrast to the darkness unfolding within one of its residents. The mundanity of his behavior amplified the horror of the acts themselves, underscoring the terrifying capacity for a human being to compartmentalize and function in public while harboring the aftermath of violence. Police reports and eyewitness accounts confirmed the eerie normality. Staff recalled his politeness and patience, with no visible agitation or hint of recognition that he had just committed a double homicide. Even as officers arrived to apprehend him, Nick's movements were deliberate, compliant, and eerily composed. This sequence of behavior illustrated a broader psychological phenomenon, a combination of detachment, practiced restraint, and emotional suppression that allowed him to move seamlessly between the ordinary and the extraordinary, between innocence in appearance and culpability in reality. In sum, the hours following the murders reveal a disturbing pattern. Nick Reiner, having committed a violent and irreversible act, conducted himself with an almost surreal composure, moving among public spaces without detection, displaying no overt signs of guilt or panic. His calmness, measured movements, and compliance with law enforcement created a chilling juxtaposition to the severity of his crime. It was a striking continuation of the detachment and emotional distance that had been evident throughout his prior life, a reminder that the outward appearance of normalcy can mask inner turmoil and moral collapse. Nick Reiner's relationship with his father, Rob Reiner, and the emotional dynamics captured in interviews provide a critical window into the underlying fractures that defined his upbringing. In promotional interviews for Being Charlie, the stark contrast between father and son was immediately evident. Rob Reiner exuded warmth, empathy, and a sustained effort to reach his son emotionally, sitting attentively, maintaining eye contact, and framing his questions and commentary with genuine concern. Every word Rob spoke seemed calculated to convey care, a desire to bridge the gap that had long existed between him and Nick. His tone softened whenever he mentioned Nick, reflecting a parent acutely aware of his child's struggles and deeply invested in his recovery. Nick's responses, however, were markedly different. From the very first seconds, he exhibited a distant, emotionless demeanor. His voice was flat and monotone, his gaze often drifting away from both his father and the interviewer. When asked about his childhood and their father-son relationship, he stated plainly, "We didn't connect much when I was young," offering no further explanation, no elaboration, and no emotional reflection. His posture was stiff, his movements minimal, as if he were physically present but emotionally withdrawn, creating a palpable tension in the room. The gap between Rob's warmth and Nick's detachment was unmistakable, a silent testament to a relationship strained by unspoken conflicts and unresolved grievances. This emotional distance was further exacerbated by Nick's history of addiction and repeated rehabilitation attempts. In the interviews, he spoke candidly about entering rehab 18 times, framing each episode not as a step toward healing, but as a compulsory intervention imposed by his parents. He described his substance use not as a pursuit of pleasure, but as a method to escape the overwhelming pressures of life, the chaotic noise of expectation, and the perceived restrictions placed upon him. His calm delivery of these confessions, devoid of visible remorse or panic, highlighted a deeply entrenched pattern of emotional detachment. Addiction, for Nick, became both a coping mechanism and a means of asserting control over his own mind, a way to create distance from both external authority and internal turmoil. Rob Reiner's attempts at connecting with Nick through film and public appearances were equally poignant and revealing. During the Being Charlie interviews, Rob emphasized his unconditional love, referring to Nick as the heart and soul of the film and attempting to use shared creative experiences as a bridge toward understanding. Yet Nick remained aloof. Even as Rob sought laughter, camaraderie, and warmth to ease tension, Nick often employed dark humor and detached commentary, stripping interactions of emotional depth and reinforcing the emotional barriers that had long separated them. This dynamic suggested that, while Rob's intentions were genuine, the methods of intervention may have unintentionally reinforced Nick's sense of alienation. The interviews also shed light on the paradox of care and control. Nick repeatedly expressed that his parents' love, though sincere, often manifested as a form of supervision and constraint. The intensity of concern, the structured interventions, and the high expectations created a pressure that he internalized as both protective and punitive. Music, once an outlet of personal expression and a tool for survival, became another domain where Nick felt stifled. The very efforts intended to nurture his creativity instead contributed to feelings of confinement and resentment, illustrating how well-intentioned care can sometimes exacerbate emotional strain when not paired with understanding of autonomy and psychological complexity. Observing Nick's demeanor in these interviews, one notices a consistent pattern: emotional withdrawal, minimal physical gestures, flat affect, and avoidance of eye contact. His brief, monosyllabic answers, combined with subtle signs of tension such as restless hands and occasional forced smiles, painted a picture of a person habitually guarding his internal world. Even when Rob Reiner expressed self-reproach and admitted to misjudgments in parenting and treatment approaches, Nick remained largely impervious, responding only with minimal acknowledgement, as if participating in the conversation as an observer rather than a fully engaged participant. Moreover, Nick's attitude toward his own experiences, homelessness, addiction, and repeated rehabilitation, was presented as objective reporting rather than personal reflection. He recounted episodes of sleeping outdoors in multiple states, detailing events with a stark lack of emotion, emphasizing facts over feelings. The interviews highlighted a mind capable of rational narration, but largely detached from the emotional consequences of his life, reinforcing the chilling sense that he existed in a separate internal reality, partially insulated from the impact of his own actions and from the concern of those closest to him. Ultimately, Part 4 reveals a profound and tragic disconnect. Rob Reiner's persistent efforts, while rooted in love and concern, were met with Nick's entrenched emotional withdrawal and detachment. The combination of parental intervention, structured rehabilitation, and unaddressed psychological instability created an environment in which emotional barriers solidified rather than softened. The interviews expose a young man trapped between the external expectation of love and guidance and the internal drive toward detachment and emotional self-preservation. The seeds of disconnection, indifference, and latent violence that would later culminate in tragedy were clearly observable, underscoring the heartbreaking reality that even the deepest parental care cannot always bridge the gulf created by complex psychological challenges. Nick Reiner's descent into psychological instability and eventual violence cannot be understood without examining the interplay between his addiction, diagnosed personality disorder, and the persistent pressures exerted by his family. Despite growing up in a wealthy and supportive environment, Nick's life was shaped by a paradox of excessive care and restrictive control. His parents, Rob and Michelle Reiner, sought to provide him with the best possible treatment, enrolling him in numerous rehabilitation programs, providing access to luxury care, and attempting to shield him from the consequences of addiction. Yet for Nick, these interventions, though well-intentioned, often felt coercive, stifling, and punitive. Throughout his public interviews and recovered video footage, Nick described entering rehab 18 times. He framed these experiences not as voluntary efforts to heal, but as imposed disruptions that removed him from his preferred environment, while simultaneously failing to address the underlying emotional and psychological issues. Addiction was, in his words, not a choice, but a coping mechanism, a way to numb the chaos created by both internal turmoil and external expectations. Substance abuse allowed him to create distance from reality, to disengage from the pressures of familial scrutiny, and to suppress feelings of guilt, fear, and inadequacy. Nick's diagnosed schizophrenia, and the adjustments to his psychiatric medications in the months leading up to the murders added a volatile layer to this already fragile equilibrium. While he may have appeared calm and rational on the surface, his mental state was profoundly unstable. The combination of untreated or inadequately managed mental illness with persistent addictive behaviors created an environment in which minor stressors could trigger disproportionately severe reactions. The videos and interviews from 2016 and subsequent years revealed patterns of emotional detachment, monotone speech, and a consistent inability to connect with others on a meaningful level. These patterns suggested a mind that had adapted to chronic dysfunction by shutting down emotionally and socially. The paradox of Nick's relationship with his parents further complicated his psychological profile. Rob and Michelle Reiner loved their son deeply and demonstrated this through repeated interventions, engagement in his creative endeavors, and unwavering support through periods of homelessness and addiction. Yet Nick perceived this care as restrictive, a form of control that limited his autonomy and suffocated his individuality. Music, which had once been a lifeline and creative outlet, became constrained by parental oversight and expectations. In interviews, Nick described a survival instinct tied to his artistic expression, a need to create and release that was hindered by excessive concern. The very acts intended to nurture him contributed unintentionally to his growing resentment and sense of confinement. Nick's candid discussion of his addiction revealed both insight and detachment. He spoke openly about periods of homelessness in multiple states, long stretches of sleeping outdoors, and the use of substances as a method to cope with emotional pain. These events were recounted as factual reports rather than personal experiences, highlighting his disconnection from the emotional impact of his own life. He did not seek pity or forgiveness, but merely described the realities of his existence with cold precision. Even when acknowledging that his parents loved him and had consistently provided support, he described a paradoxical tension. He felt both cared for and controlled, grateful for their interventions, yet frustrated by the boundaries imposed upon him. The cumulative effect of addiction, mental illness, and perceived parental control fostered an internalized anger and growing alienation. Nick's humor, often dark and detached, became a vehicle to express this tension. He used irony and sarcasm as shields, laughing at his own circumstances to maintain distance from emotional engagement. In public and private interviews, these traits were consistently observed. Restless hands, avoidance of eye contact, monotone speech, and minimal physical gestures all reinforced a sense of detachment. The combination of these behaviors signaled a person who had learned to suppress vulnerability and cultivate emotional distance as a protective mechanism. Yet simultaneously, this detachment allowed impulses to fester unchecked. Importantly, Nick's internal conflict was not simply a matter of defiance or rebellion. It was the product of multiple intersecting pressures: the expectations imposed by a high-profile family, the isolation and stigma of repeated rehab interventions, the limitations of psychiatric treatment, and his own neuropsychological vulnerabilities. His statements indicate that he understood the paradox of his situation. He acknowledged his parents' love, expressed guilt over his failures, and recognized the destructive potential of his choices. But he remained unable to reconcile these realities into constructive behavior. Ultimately, Part 5 illustrates the complex, dangerous interplay of mental illness, addiction, and family dynamics. Nick's personality disorder, untreated or poorly managed, combined with repeated enforced interventions and a life of relative isolation, created conditions in which latent violent tendencies could surface. The videos, interviews, and public statement from his life prior to the murders reveal a man trapped within his own psychological labyrinth, constantly monitored yet emotionally isolated, loved yet controlled, desperate for freedom yet constrained by circumstance. This intricate web of influences laid the groundwork for the tragic outcome, underscoring that wealth, care, and privilege alone cannot always prevent the escalation of internal turmoil into catastrophic violence. Nick Reiner's courtroom appearances provide a chilling lens into the continuation of his emotional detachment and psychological instability following the murders of his parents. On December 17, 2025, he appeared for the first time at the Los Angeles Superior Court, facing charges of 2 counts of first-degree murder. Entering the courtroom in a thick blue anti-suicide jacket, with his hands and legs shackled, Nick presented an almost statue-like figure. He sat slightly hunched, rigid in posture, his gaze fixed forward, eyes vacant, and showed no visible reaction as the indictment was read aloud. There was no bowing, no trembling, and no apparent acknowledgement of the gravity of the proceedings. His communication during the hearing was minimal. When the judge asked if he understood his legal rights and consented to waive a speedy trial, he responded tersely, "Yes, Your Honor." 3 words, delivered monotonously, without emphasis, emotion, or inflection. This sparse communication echoed the detachment observed in his past interviews and videos, reinforcing a pattern of profound emotional disengagement. Throughout the hearing, Nick remained silent, allowing the court proceedings to unfold around him as though they were entirely separate from his reality. He was denied bail and remained in custody without the possibility of release, a reflection of both the severity of his crimes and the court's recognition of his psychological instability. Nick's defense attorney, Alan Jackson, a prominent criminal lawyer known for representing high-profile clients, emphasized the complexity of the case and urged the public to refrain from judgment. He requested additional time to prepare a defense and for Nick to undergo a full mental health evaluation. Jackson's cautious approach highlighted the critical role of mental health in the proceedings, implicitly acknowledging that Nick's diagnosed schizophrenia and fluctuating psychiatric medication were central factors in both the crime and the legal strategy. Sources close to the investigation revealed that changes in his prescriptions in the weeks preceding the murders contributed to his deteriorating mental state, creating a volatile environment in which controlling impulses became increasingly difficult. The courtroom behavior of Nick also revealed the ongoing influence of his personality disorder. His rigid posture, lack of expression, and emotional void were consistent with the patterns identified in prior video footage. Even within a highly structured and controlled environment, he maintained a level of detachment that was both unnerving and illustrative of his internalized emotional isolation. This detachment was not a display of composure, but a reflection of profound dissociation from both his own actions and their social consequences. Witnesses and court officials noted that his silence and vacant stare evoked a sense of caution and unease, creating an atmosphere in which the enormity of the crime was amplified by the eerie calm of the perpetrator. The legal proceedings also provided insight into the ongoing psychological challenges Nick faced. Reports indicated that he remained under psychiatric supervision in custody, with continued monitoring to assess both physical and mental stability. The combination of a severe mental health diagnosis, a history of addiction, and the acute stress of facing trial created a precarious situation in which his capacity for emotional response and engagement was severely compromised. The court's response, including the denial of bail and structured observation, reflected a recognition of the potential risk posed by both his actions and his psychological condition. In addition to the legal formalities, the court appearances offered a sobering contrast to Nick's earlier life of privilege and public attention. Once the focus of media coverage surrounding Being Charlie, Nick's public persona had shifted from a troubled, yet visible, figure to one enveloped in silence and isolation. The courtroom became a stark stage where his prior detachment, emotional withdrawal, and disconnection from reality were made manifest. Each motion, each statement by his attorney, and each procedural action highlighted the interplay between legal responsibility and psychological complexity. Observers noted that Nick's behavior in court mirrored the patterns previously seen in interviews and personal accounts. His flat affect, minimal verbal interaction, and refusal to engage emotionally with the process reflected a deeply ingrained coping mechanism developed over years of addiction, repeated rehabilitation, and emotional alienation from his family. Even as the proceedings addressed the most serious legal consequences imaginable, Nick remained detached, suggesting that the emotional and psychological forces driving his past behavior had not dissipated but were instead entrenched. Ultimately, Part 6 illustrates the ongoing consequences of Nick Reiner's complex psychological profile within the formal setting of the justice system. His courtroom demeanor underscores a pattern of profound detachment, emotional suppression, and dissociation, linking directly to his past behavior and interactions with his parents. The proceedings emphasize the critical role of mental health in understanding both the motivations behind his actions and the challenges inherent in addressing a person whose emotional world is largely inaccessible. Nick's silent, vacant presence in court serves as a stark reminder that the impact of psychological instability extends far beyond private life, shaping interactions with society, the legal system, and the very structures designed to administer justice. The story of Nick Reiner concludes not with a single explosive moment, but with a haunting accumulation of silence, detachment, and unheeded warning signs. From the earliest videos in 2016 to his arrest and first court appearance in late 2025, a consistent pattern emerged: emotional withdrawal, monotone speech, and a chilling ability to dissociate from reality. Observers, in retrospect, can trace a trajectory of psychological instability marked by addiction, repeated rehabilitation, personality disorder, and a profound sense of alienation from both family and society. These elements, combined, created conditions in which latent violent impulses could escalate to catastrophic outcomes. Nick's parents, Rob and Michelle Reiner, acted with genuine love and tireless dedication throughout his life. They provided access to high-quality care, repeatedly attempted to guide him through rehabilitation, and sought connection through creative projects such as Being Charlie. Despite these efforts, Nick's detachment and perception of care as constraint fostered resentment and isolation rather than healing. Music, once a lifeline, became another domain where he felt restricted. Even under the most nurturing circumstances, Nick's internal struggle persisted, illustrating that love and resources alone cannot always mitigate the effects of severe psychological disorders. Throughout all interviews and footage, Nick's behavior reflected a chilling equilibrium. Outwardly compliant, often calm, yet internally volatile and disconnected. He presented factual recounts of trauma, addiction, and hardship without emotion, using dark humor and detachment as shields. In public, he could navigate ordinary environments, convenience stores, streets, even courtroom proceedings, without revealing the inner turmoil that had been building for years. His ability to function in these spaces masked a mental state that, unchecked, culminated in the tragic murder of his parents. The tragedy underscores the profound importance of recognizing and interpreting early warning signs. Nick's behavior, violent statements, emotional withdrawal, detachment from reality, and repeated failure to engage meaningfully with care was consistently visible across years of footage and interviews. Each instance was a potential signal of escalating danger. Yet the signs were subtle, easily dismissed, or misunderstood, highlighting the difficulty of preventing tragedy in cases of complex psychological and emotional disturbance. Ultimately, the story of Nick Reiner is a grim reminder of the limits of parental love, intervention, and privilege when confronted with severe mental illness compounded by addiction. It is a narrative where wealth, attention, and repeated rehabilitation could not prevent the collapse of internal stability. The case forces reflection on the ways society, families, and professionals detect and respond to hidden distress. Early acknowledgement, intervention, and comprehensive mental health support remain essential in preventing similar outcomes. Nick Reiner's life and actions illustrate the delicate interplay between psychological vulnerability and environment, the unseen cracks beneath outward normalcy, and the devastating consequences when those cracks are left unaddressed. It is a cautionary tale, not only of a tragic crime, but of the silent signals that, if observed and acted upon, may offer a chance to intervene before tragedy strikes. In examining these videos and accounts, one is left with a chilling question. How many warnings can go unnoticed before the inevitable collapse? The weight of that reflection is as haunting as the events themselves.